Sometimes even in the church, we fear if we work hard, somehow we're going to get God's grace. That's not what that means. It means it is God's grace combined with our obedient lives. And some people want obedient lives that don't have sacrifice or even discipline or commitment. Across social media, just in the last few months, I've seen several times the phrase, choose your hard. You may have seen it. But I think there's a great message. It says, marriage is hard, divorce is hard, choose your hard. Obesity is hard. Staying fit is hard. Choose your hard. Living within your means is hard. Living with debt is hard. Choose your hard. Serving Jesus is hard. But the ramifications of not serving Jesus is hard. Choose your hard. It's not the choice between easy and hard. It's just choosing which path you're going to take. It was not easy for Daniel to stand up to the overseer, but he did. And he did by rejecting the label instilled upon him in a different country. Again, many of us can identify with Daniel. You may be in a place you never intended to be. Maybe it was bad choices. Maybe it was totally outside your control. But though you may be where you don't want to be, you don't have to be who you don't want to be in that place. And you're not alone. Reject the label. Let's move on. Resolution of heart. Verse 8, New American Standard says, but Daniel made up his mind. Literally, in the original, but Daniel set his heart on something. And we're going to see what that is, not to defile himself. I like the quote by Charles Haddon Spurgeon, of two evils, choose neither. Now, some believe that refers to our upcoming election. That's not my application this morning. Is that Daniel could have chosen acceptance, okay, I'll take the food, or deception. I won't take the food, but I'll act like I take the food. But that wasn't the course that he took. Again, the prayer clauses is going to be presented later in the story. You remember with the lion's den encounter. But I believe it began at the beginning. And in prayer, he decided before the Lord, these are my boundaries. This far and no more. And don't miss this, folks, that who Daniel was determined in Jerusalem, not Babylon. It was determined in Jerusalem, not Babylon. Well, what does that mean? That means you set your boundaries in your prayer closet, not in the middle of a date, not at a party that you're attending. I used to tell young people all the time, before you leave your house, you better know this far and no more. And again, as a youth pastor, I can't count how many times. Pastor Maury, I never intended to do that. One thing led to another. It was never my plan. I just found myself. And of course, my question, why did you find yourself? Why were you past that boundary, those rails that God gives us for protection, not to deny us, but to free us, actually. And young people, again, it's not just you. Those of us in the business world, other things, whether it's cutting corners on taxes or other business challenges that we have. Integrity is what we decide before we leave the house, not in the boardroom when others are being pulled in a direction that you realize really isn't fully truthful and honest. It says in the text, he would not defile himself. Again, what are those limits that God has placed from his word into your heart? Verse 9 is a beautiful passage. It says, now God granted Daniel favor. Doesn't that sound familiar? Remember Joseph over and over. But God granted Joseph favor there in Potiphar's house and then in the prison. And in verse 12, you see conviction combined with wisdom. Daniel doesn't demand his way. Verse 8 says he asks permission, and then he actually has a plan. Would you allow us for 10 days to do this? Now, I'll be honest, as a kid, I thought Daniel chapter 1 was a chapter that I had to eat my carrots. That's how my parents viewed this, that, look at Daniel, he ate his vegetables, and look how strong he was. And actually, studying God's word, I think it's deeper than that. Now parents, use what you need. But I believe the point is not that it was vegetables over meat. In fact, what was the issue? Well, there are two clear ones. One, it was not kosher. Okay, you realize that. It was not according to the Mosaic dietary laws. And anything made in a non-kosher kitchen would not be kosher. But some of these would have been animals that were forbidden. And I believe even more importantly, some, if not all of this, would have been sacrificed to idols. And for that reason, Daniel and his friends said, no, I will not defile myself. Now, again, don't miss this. That's the part they control. Now, could they have been forced? Yes, they could have. There are some things outside of our control, but they said, basically, as long as it depends upon me, I will not defile myself. Conviction was what they stood upon. I was looking this week, it's hard to believe, almost 70 years ago. You may recognize the woman in the photo behind me. December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks entered a bus there in Montgomery, Alabama, and she sat down in the front, and she was told to move back, and she refused. And the Montgomery Metro boycott began that week, and many of you know the changes that happened. And it began with the conviction. No, my conviction is this. And I may be called a lesser person, but I'm not going to accept a lesser label. And Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah came to the point where they said, we will not defile ourselves. So the question, what about us? Are those limits firm or are they kind of flexible? Well, if you want to go along to get along, sometimes that may be wise, but in terms of conviction, it really isn't. Again, these young 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, they set an example by rejecting the labels of their day. A resolution of heart to say, we will stand firm. Well, what happens? Well, we do find a realization of God's plan. If you were to summarize the book of Daniel in 2 words, it would be this: God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. Well, God's sovereign in a foreign nation? Yes, He is. With foreign pagan kings? Yes, He is. God is sovereign in all things. And so later when we see the amazing dreams that come and go, and we see the fiery furnace, and we see the lion's den, do you realize that none of that would have happened if they'd failed the test of chapter 1? You see, if they had joined the others at the table, there would be no testimony to stand up to this king and subsequent kings that are going to come. I don't know if you heard the progression a while ago, but first God listened, and then the overseer listened, and then the king listened when these 4 youth spoke. And even more than what they said, their lives exhibited. Again, in Daniel, you see he was courteous in verse 8, asking for permission. Verse 10, he was reasonable. Please, sir, give us 10 days. And then young people, I want you to hear this third one. He was hardworking. I think there's some that discount that. And sometimes even in the church, we fear if we work hard, somehow we're going against God's grace. That's not what that means. It means it is God's grace combined with our obedient lives. And some people want obedient lives that don't have sacrifice or even discipline or commitment. And again, verse 17, he says, as for these 4 youths, God gave. That's grace. But in verse 20, it says, they proved themselves 10 times greater than the others. That's work. That's investment. That's study. That's proving themselves a rightful servant of the Lord. And in that, God blessed them. It's both. Again, I heard the story years ago about a farmer who bought a dilapidated shack in a neglected field. And he worked so hard to rebuild the home. And he invested in the field there. He tilled it and he fertilized it and he seeded it. And at the end of the harvest, there was a bumper crop. And one of his pious neighbors came by and he said, wow, God has given a great crop. And he went on how God has blessed you. God has done this, God has done that. And finally, the guy had enough. He said, you should have seen it when God had it by himself. And again, I'm not sacrilegious here, but I'm saying that it's both. That it isn't that we sit in a dilapidated house and say, God bless the crops. Is God use me to bless the crops. And we see in Daniel both. Yes, God blessed, and he found favor, undeserved grace, and yet he worked and he applied himself along with these others. What about us? Are we making wise decisions? Or are we actually applying ourselves to the directions of God's word? What if Daniel had been disqualified at that table? Then again, we wouldn't see the life that grew. And the biblical principle, you know, that those who are faithful in small things are often given opportunities to be faithful in bigger things. And that's how the story is going to unfold. Some of you may recognize the name Fred Akers. He was a coach at the University of Texas years ago, a football coach, and as almost all football coaches, he was fired there from his position. And at the press conference, I came across this statement. He said, "I can't always control the circumstances, but I can control my response." And I thought, that's it. We can't control many of the circumstances we're placed in, whether at work or home, school, community, but we can control our response. Do we have a godly response even when there's an ungodly attack against us? As our title this morning says, unmoved. Do we take a stand to say we will stand upon a rock? That's how you're unmoved. It's not just by determination, it's by position. Are you standing on an unmoved object? Are you upon a rock that does not move? And throughout Daniel, we will see them making choice after choice after choice to say, my hope is in the Lord. My faith is in the Lord.